I'm on this thing about feminist science again, and whether it makes any sense to talk about feminist science or feminist epistemology. And I know it was a big thing a few years back, and there hasn't been an awful lot spoken about it lately, but I think it's well, it's just an interesting set of ideas. That I guess the directions that I'm coming in on is based on two books or articles, really, two sets of ideas. One is this thing that Helen Cixous talks about in this essay Sorties that I've talked about before, in which she says that one of the primary ways in which we think is according to binaries. We divide things into mutually opposing opposites, or mutually complementary opposites. Things like black, white, soft, hard, active, passive, those kind of things. And she says that one of the key determinants of that binary is male, female. So in addition to those other ones I've just listed, there also is male, female. And for Cixous, the male-female divide is primary. That's the first division. I don't know where she gets that from. I'm guessing, well, I know she comes out of Freud and that kind of Freudian, Lacanian psychoanalytic tradition. But either way, wherever she comes from, that's what she's saying. And she also says that we have a tendency to associate the terms on one side of the binary with each other. So soft is associated with female, is associated with passivity, is associated with nurturing, those kind of things. Hard is associated with male, is associated with activity, is associated with aggression. So there's a whole series of opposites which they don't attract one another, but they attract each other from each side of the binary. So that's one of the directions I'm coming at feminist science from, that set of ideas. And the other is from George Lakoff and ideas to do with cognitive philosophy, cognitive embodied cognition, those ideas. And particularly this book he wrote some time ago called Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. And in that, it's a great book, fantastic book, but in it he's talking about how in different languages, and presumably in the cognition which is expressed in those languages, there is a kind of blurring of categorical distinctions, not a blurring of the members of different categories. We think in terms of categories, and the members of those categories are slightly idiosyncratic. They're not necessarily logical in that kind of formal sense that we think of. And the title of the book gives the game away in that. There's one language I think he's talking about, which is, I think, one of the Australian Aboriginal languages, in which there is a particular tense of the verbs, a particular way of speaking, in which captures a whole range of different aspects of that experience. And three of those things it captures are things to do with fire, things to do with women, and things to do with dangerous things. All those, it sounds Borgesian, that sort of category, but that's apparently in that particular language. Those entities which fall into those categories are all addressed in the same verb tense, or have the same kind of language associated with them, which means they're connected in some way, cognitively. And that seems alien to us, but it only seems alien to us because it's largely invisible, because it's not something we think about, it's the thing we think with, and is therefore largely invisible. Even things like the way that the French use gender terms for nouns. All nouns in French are either le or la, which means they're all male or female, which again seems slightly strange if you're an English speaker. But we unproblematically also gender lots of our words and lots of our concepts. So I was watching a video recently that Professor Anton and Professor Peterson were talking about in relation to the feminist science, actually. And without a break, Professor Peterson used the word master in relation to how you might gain information or knowledge about something, gain scientific control. And the fact that the word like master, which of course is deeply gendered, just passes unnoticed through the tissue of language that we're all sort of stretching between ourselves, is kind of indicative of how those things are also featured in English, even though we don't necessarily recognise them. So why am I saying all that? Okay, those are the directions in. God, that took a long time to say. So those are the directions in to feminist science. The two distinct, I would just say there are two ways in which science is gendered, or could be gendered, and they overlap. One is to do with language, and I think certainly until relatively recently, the way that science was spoken about, possibly the way that it was carried out as well, but certainly the way that it was spoken about was deeply gendered. I cited Roger Bacon, I think, in the last video I made, as the archetypal example of a male approach to science, in which the language in which he speaks about what he's doing is all to do with rape and violence and aggression and tearing open and that kind of activity. And even though that's an extreme example, certainly until relatively recently, science was heavily gendered in its descriptions. You know, it was all about probing, exploring, opening out. You know, there was a lot of that kind of language going on. I think that's far less so now. I think if you read any of the popular writings on science, like Dawkins or Carl Sagan or any of these people, the language is much more complex now and much more likely to move between feminine and masculine metaphors, metaphors which have more association in that Cixous sense, or more association in that Lakoff sense, with other terms which are thought of as masculine, or other terms which are thought of as feminine. So I think it's more varied now. But the other thing is to do with, so that's one way in which science could be feminine or masculine in the way it's spoken about, not the science itself, just the language around it. And then in terms of the science itself, I think there is something to do with the way we perceive the data that's produced. Some sciences, they're usually called the hard sciences, produce what's often called hard data. Some variants of physics do this, some variations of mathematics, not all physics, not all mathematics. Some aspects of biology do this, and they produce relatively secure facts and relatively secure theories and data. And the image of that data, the image of those facts, is as a series of kind of hard, robust, well-defined objects out there in space. Other sets of science, usually the social sciences and those which blur into the humanities, things like sociology and psychology and any of the social sciences really, don't produce hard data. They produce data which is much more fuzzy around the edges, which is much more blurry, which is much more reliant upon statistical probabilities, those kind of and trends. It would talk about trends. It would talk about political science is all about predicting trends. It doesn't produce hard data. So if we can imagine hard science as producing hard objects, figuratively, then soft sciences produce soft objects. Social sciences, political sciences, these produce imaginary objects which are kind of soft and yielding and perhaps slightly evanescent and slightly fluffy. And because of those reasons, again, I'm looking at Cixous, and here again I'm looking at Lakoff. Because of all those associations of softness and fluffy and yieldingness, those facts and those data start to feel slightly feminine, or they start to be feminized by association. So it's not so much that the science is female or feminine or feminist, either in its discussion or its practice. It's that either the language around that science uses male or female metaphors, or the objects of knowledge which are produced as a result of that science are characteristically male or characteristically female through that series of metaphorical associations. At least that would be my take on it.